Transmitting from the Mojave Wilderness in Joshua Tree, California, now is the time for Desert Oracle Radio, the voice of the desert.
Well, night has fallen on the desert and it's still Halloween. It is still Halloween in our hearts. It's Halloween time. But we must admit that it is November now. It's November 2019. And that's when the movie Blade Runner takes place. The 1982 movie based on a Philip K. Dick book and named for an unrelated screenplay by William S. Burroughs. So welcome to the Blade Runner time. We've got too much packed into tonight's show, so we are going to get right to it. We're going to be bringing on our first guest, Jason P. Woodbury of Phoenix, Arizona. I believe he's originally from Coolidge, who will be joining us now and again to talk about some of the great mysteries in the world of popular music, or music in general. Tonight we're also going to hear from Laura Bolt. Laura is an occult writer and kind of a witch. This is the time of year you want to talk to such people. Jason Woodbury is going to talk to us about a singer-songwriter who just disappeared in the desert. No trace of him ever found. And he was on the way to Nashville, having left Los Angeles. And his name was Jim Sullivan. So welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us tonight on Desert Oracle Radio. Now let's get to the weird stuff. I just thought of this because I was reading a book by Jacques Vallée called Revelations. It's a 30-year-old book. He's an astronomer, French astronomer, who's an important figure in ufology, the study of UFOs. There's the character in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He's an interesting character. He was one of the early inventors of the internet.
Right.
He's also friends with people like Robert Anton Wilson and Anton LaVey, and the sort of Bay Area occult underground culture. So
yes, he was hanging out with some cool, strange, weird folks.
And he shows how some of these things were intentional deceptions run by various intelligence operations. And it's interesting. But then you get to the cattle mutilations, and he spends a lot of the book on cattle mutilations. And one thing I did not realize about the huge wave, they go back forever, but the huge wave that started in 1976 centered on Colorado. And there were hundreds and hundreds of incidents all over the West in a couple of year period starting in 76, is that there were really distinct global pattern UFO phenomena that would happen with these cattle and other animals, sometimes sheep, being just absurdly dissected and having various organs exactly removed, no blood, a circle of flattened earth or wheat or whatever at the site, and these kind of wide red things that would be seen hovering over the area and then would shoot straight up into the sky. And there's stories like this from Zimbabwe, and southern part of the African continent, Europe. And these animals are just like murdered in the weirdest ways.
Right.
And it's never been explained. You know, it was like the biggest manhunt or whatever hunt in Colorado history. Just thousands of troopers and highway patrol and county cops all trying to organize and catch whatever was killing all these cattle on all these farms everywhere. And they never even got a suspect, ever.
Right. Huh.
And they'd happen like when roads were blocked.
Right. So that with no way to access these where these things were taking place.
Yeah. And I finished that part of the book, and I was walking back from the restaurant, and I was thinking, you know, that's more connected possibly to the Jim Sullivan story than the more space brother kind of UFO stories that I think somehow he's kind of more associated with.
Well, sure. So the timeline lines up pretty well. He disappeared in 1975, like March of 75.
They were going on.
And I think that space brother thing comes a lot from sort of the tone of specifically the song UFO from his 1969 album, where he's kind of discussing this maybe like a visitor or something along those lines who he's questioning, you know, did he come by UFO? So it's kind of like I think that has a lot to do with it. And I think that within the counterculture, you know, Jim and his wife, Barbara, who worked for Capitol Records, they were probably pretty immersed with the idea of Space Brothers, you know, that kind of thing. I think that a lot of people conceived of extraterrestrial visitors. They kind of viewed the idea of that through the lens of the counterculture itself, and so like anybody who would be coming to visit us would be very groovy and cool. You know what I mean? Like kind of down. So
and that was also a period in the early into the mid 70s when a number of people, especially on the West Coast, artists, writers, musicians, were having these very intense experiences where they thought they were communicating or being directly kind of broadcast to by an alien intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely. There were a ton of people who had that kind of feeling of a transmission occurring, you know, and that they were receiving this data from someplace else.
Right, like the Altered States guy, John Lilly.
Yeah.
He's on this is in Eric Davis's book, High Weirdness. He's on an airplane coming into LAX, and this comet that was a big media sensation, and kind of fizzled out. It wasn't that big a deal. It didn't look as impressive as people thought it would. But anyway, he's looking out the window of his plane, and he's looking at the comet, and he gets a message from this thing, the solid state intelligence. And it says, I'm going to show you my power. I'm going to shut down the airport so this plane won't land. And he's freaking out, you know. He's also high as a kite, but
maybe not connected. Or maybe connected.
And then the pilot comes on and says, we've been diverted. The power went out at LAX. The power went out because a plane crashed into some transformers.
Wow. Yeah.
I mean, there were like weird, sinister messages coming down all the time. Some people thought it was something more positive. Why don't you tell us, for those of us like myself who only learned about Jim Sullivan's music really in the last year or so, who Jim Sullivan is and your connection to him?
Sure. So Jim Sullivan was sort of he was kind of like a weird, mystic, country rock, psychedelic folk songwriter who released 2 incredible albums in 1969 and then in 1972. In 1969, he released an album called UFO. And UFO was this record produced by a guy named Al Dobbs, who knew all the members of the Wrecking Crew, who were sort of LA's finest session people. And so he convened all these folks, and they played this record, UFO, which is sort of weird, and it's kind of funky, but at the same time it's very rooted in folk and like country traditions. I know that the folks at Light in the Attic Records who have reissued it, you know, they cite like David Axelrod as sort of a reference point where there's like a very sophisticated thing going on, but it's also very like earthy. So he made this record and shopped it around and nobody bought it. It was released on Al Dobbs' own label, Money Records. So nobody bought this one, but Jim kept pushing, and eventually he got signed to Playboy Records. Hugh Hefner had a short-lived record label, and that's where he recorded another album, a self-titled effort, in 1972. And Light in the Attic has recently reissued that record, and I wrote new liner notes for it that were based on interviews I did with the producer Lee Birch and the session man Jim Hugart, who, among others, kind of created the soundscapes that you hear on the second Jim Sullivan record.
Okay. So you're not doing a bit of art appreciation on these liner notes. You're doing research work.
I did, yeah. I like poetic musings about music a lot, and that's sometimes what we do at Aquarium Drunkard, where I write a lot. But yeah, no, I dug in, and the folks at Light in the Attic had some studio logs and some documents that sort of were related to it, and I went back and with original copies of the record, kind of researched those liner notes and followed those through. But yeah, thankfully for me, Lee and the other Jim Hugart, were around to talk to me about their personal connection to Jim Sullivan and what it was like to work on this record. Jim was a fascinating dude. Like he hung out at the time with like major guys around town, around Los Angeles. You know, Lee Marvin, Lee Majors, Harry Dean Stanton. He's in the movie Easy Rider. He has like an extra. So
no kidding. He was an Easy Rider.
Yeah, he's part of the commune where when they show up, he's got like this giant mustache, and I pulled out my Criterion edition and like located him in the frame and stuff. And so yeah, this was a research project, and luckily I had honestly a couple of years to work on it while Light in the Attic was readying the release of this record. So the new Jim Sullivan reissue is just recently out, along with a collection of demos he did that's called if the evening were dawn. So that's never been heard. But this Playboy record, it made it out there a little bit, and I think it garnered some okay reviews, but for whatever reason it just didn't land. And it's a little bit less ethereal than UFO, but it's definitely still got a little bit of a spooky quality that kind of separates Jim from the average folkies of the day, I think.
Yeah, he has a haunting about him that it really kind of hangs on to all the songs, you know. It's not a heavy kind of goth haunting, but
no.
But there's something just kind of open and mysterious about it, and it's something that a lot of Southwest music that's really effective has about it, you know, some sort of kind of space in the landscape, I guess. And
yeah, that's right.
And some of the songs are they're kind of difficult, you know. They're kind of intentionally difficult. They're kind of
sure.
They're interesting, and you can see why a guy like Harry Dean Stanton would want to hang around him and listen to him.
Yeah, especially Harry Dean, for sure. Yeah, and I mean, I go back and forth. A couple years ago, I wrote an article for the Los Angeles Review of Books that was going to be an Aquarium Drunkard column, and then stuff shifted around, and it was published as that, but it was the only one that ended up getting done. But I wrote about Jim Sullivan, and I wrote about the allure of mystery when it comes to music and when it comes to these kinds of artists who were sort of lost to time. And I think that with Jim Sullivan, the mystery of him and the mystery of whatever happened to Jim, because I don't know if we've already mentioned it or not, but he disappeared in New Mexico in 1975.
Yeah,
He up and vanished.
We really haven't talked about it. Why don't you tell us what happened? Because for a lot of people, that's kind of the entry point into his music.
Certainly the entry point for me. Yeah, absolutely. So after he released this Playboy record, and it didn't yield a big hit, things kind of got tough. And I think from what I understand, Jim kind of started drinking a little bit more, and his marriage was starting to grow a little strained. Just sort of the pressure of trying to be a musician and trying to make your way in the world and it not quite landing. But in March of 1975, he decided it was time to give Nashville a shot. He wanted to go see if he could maybe gain some traction out there. So he left his son, Chris, and his wife, Barbara, behind, and he went out ahead of them with the intention of them joining him later in his Volkswagen Beetle. And what we know is that on March 5th, he was pulled over outside of Santa Rosa, New Mexico, which is like about 2 hours east of Albuquerque along Route 66. And he was pulled over for swerving, but he passed a field sobriety test. The cop took him out and did all that. And I think it was just maybe that the 15-hour drive had maybe got to him. And so then we know that he checked into the La Mesa Motel, and then he headed out to get some vodka at the local liquor store. And here's where stuff starts to get a little bit weird and maybe murky. A lot of the story I'm talking about, I got to credit Matt Sullivan of Light in the Attic, who went out on a road trip / fact-finding mission to kind of piece together the last, hours of Jim Sullivan as we understand, them to be. So Matt has kind of pieced together that essentially Jim decided he was going to start cruising around town, and somehow he ended up southeast of the town, near a small ranch owned by a local family called the Janettis. And this is where things get especially murky. Some reports suggest that he was driving around out by their ranch, and Mrs. Janetti came out with a ranch hand or two, and, upon seeing his lights, asked him, "Hey, do you have a problem?" And he responded, apparently, no, do you? Like, he just kind of being like a flippant, kind of maybe a slightly grouchy, slightly combative kind of fellow. And then there were other reports that he, for some reason, knocked on the family door, and that when they answered, Mrs. Giannetti didn't speak enough English. She only spoke Italian, apparently, to speak with him, to kind of figure out whatever it was, so that he tore off. So these are sort of conflicting stories.
This kind of sounds like the plot of Paris, Texas.
Yeah, it does. It does sound a lot like the plot of Paris, Texas. And at this point, maybe he just wandered off into the desert, as Harry Dean's character did, sort of there. So what we know is that the next day, police found his car near the ranch. The engine was dead, and in it was his wallet, his clothes, a reel-to-reel recorder, his 12-string Guild guitar, and a box of those Playboy LPs. And they were all left behind with no sign of Jim. And that's it. Nobody knows what happened to him. Nobody's sure what exactly went down. The police towed the car. There were search parties sent out. Barbara and her son, his wife, they came out and joined him, but Jim never turned up. A couple days later, rather, eventually, weeks or months, they found a body outside of Las Cruces, and they had reported maybe this is this guy who went missing, Jim Sullivan, but then later there was a news report that followed that up that said that they've figured out that it wasn't him, that it didn't turn him up. So there's all these theories, what happened to Jim, and I think that
who was the other guy?
Well, there's not a whole lot of concrete information. This was all stuff that was gathered from old newspaper clippings that Matt from Light in the Attic turned up, So who that guy was, I don't know, but he sort of sounded like Jim Sullivan. Apparently had a mustache and a tattoo, but apparently it was determined that it wasn't his body. His family certainly, didn't take possession of this body. They were told that it wasn't him. So what happened to Jim is the big question, and I think that
you ever been to Santa Rosa?
I've never been to Santa Rosa. No, I've never gone out. Have you?
Well, I'm sure I've gone through it.
Yeah, I would say the same, for sure.
66, pretty much wherever you can go. It was still, I kind of went on a Route 66 trip when the road was being undone in 1983.
Right.
So
right.
Which was wonderful. And I was in Farmington one night, a memorable night, right there where the 66 meets the old 666.
Yeah, spooky.
Highway 666. Now, speaking of satanic panic, as we had been earlier, Route 666, which is the most haunted road I've ever been on in my life, the Christians got up in arms. It'd been 666 forever, but in the 80s they got up in arms because now the devil was, on the loose, and they got the name of the road changed. It's the one that runs alongside Shiprock. It's incredible.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah. So we might have to go check out Santa Rosa because it sounds like bodies are just turning up all over.
Yeah, so when I combed just through, so there are a couple prominent theories about what happened to Jim. Some folks suggest that it was the cops who had pulled him over, and that maybe he had been a little too mouthy when they pulled him over upon his arrival, outside of town. He was a hippie looking dude also. You don't get to be an easy rider if you're not, I don't think. So there's a good chance that maybe he rubbed the cops the wrong way. Other people say that the Genettis were like connected to the mob or the mafia or something.
What?
Maybe he stumbled upon something and I mean, like, when I started digging around,
you talk about conspiracy theories.
Well, that's right.
You know?
That's right.
I mean, this entire thing, it's almost like nothing even vaguely weird can happen without it connecting to every other weird thing.
Yeah, for sure. And then I think that the idea of aliens, I think that comes from certain romantic notions that people have, you know? You don't write a song like UFO, the song that Jim Sullivan wrote that was included on that first album. You don't write a song like that and then not have people think about extraterrestrials when you straight up and vanish. You know what I mean? Apparently, you know, Al Dobbs, who produced that first record, he was on Coast to Coast AM around the time that Light in the Attic reissued it. And he talked about how Jim and Barbara had like a long history of UFO interests, and that they were fascinated in the idea that something might come from another world, and that really they all wanted to believe in this idea. So I think that in a weird way, faced with what I don't want to obscure as clearly a tragedy, you know, because like a woman and her son lost this part of their family, you know, like Jim was gone. No matter what happened to him, he was definitely gone from their lives, you know?
Right.
So,
well, let me ask you this, because I don't know what the personal situation was, but you mentioned earlier that they were planning to move to Nashville and join him. Now, she worked in the record industry, is that correct?
She did. She worked with Capitol Records.
So was she planning to move out and work in Nashville?
All a little unclear, but certainly one could see somebody making their way from the music industry in Los Angeles to the music industry in Nashville. You know, it would be maybe not a completely lateral move, but you know, doable for sure. So I think his instincts were really good to try to head out there, but unfortunately, he never made it. And I think that mystery has really shaded and colored the way people perceive his work after, you know? I think that the romance of that mystery is, at this point, as integral to the music as his incredible voice or his incredible lyrics.
When the sun go down every day, I got a tomcat, he's singing C-flat. Yeah, we both go out when the sun goes down every day. Yeah, we both agree that it's the nicest part of the day. I bet you want to know what we all do. Yeah, me and my old red tomcat, what we wanna say to you. He said meow wow. He said meow wow. That meaning hey hey baby, would you like to play with me? And we both agree that it's the nicest part of the day. This time, wow. That mean hell, baby. Oh, would you like?
We've got Laura Bolt on the line. Hello, Laura. Where are you tonight?
I am in cloudy, surprisingly, Los Angeles.
What is that weather? Is that autumn weather?
I think it is as close to autumn as we're going to get. It's not 90 degrees, and it's actually very moody, appropriately, for once. So I'm enjoying a rare bit of East Coast weather in usually sunny LA.
Now, there's a reason we know each other, which is fairly strange.
It's unusual, I would say. One of my more unusual professional connections.
We worked together on this sort of witchcraft concern, like, it was an online magazine. It was like kind of a pocket astrology advisor.
Yeah, it was a multi-dimensional portal into the occult via your smartphone and or your desktop.
I think that's a better description than we ever actually came up with when it was happening.
Put that on the deck there. Yeah, we didn't really get to sell that, but it's taken a while of trying to explain it to various people over the past several years. I sort of refined the description as I went.
That's good. You don't have to keep constantly kind of putting new gloss on the pitch.
Right. Well, I got to hindsight is everything, obviously, but it was a very lofty goal at the time, and we did have quite a bit of fun at the outset.
Now, we're going to talk a little bit about something that is in vogue, I suppose, a bit, which is autumn.
It's modern and vogue and of the moment.
It really is. The autumn man comes out with his coffee and his sweater, and women start wearing those high boots again, even if it's still 100 degrees. So it's
we have to. We're actually required by law. It's law on Instagram. It requires us.
The Instagram legislation that, yes, now
exactly.
controls all of our clothing choices. So we're in the northern hemisphere. Obviously, if you're listening tonight in New Zealand or something, you're not having autumn right now. But most of our listeners are up here. And why is autumn so special, and why is it so spooky?
Autumn is an important time in the witchcraft canon, obviously. So if you look at the Wheel of the Year, several points at which things transition, things change. We sort of mark the passing of time. And, so we had the equinox, obviously, recent holiday. And the equinox is one of my favorite times, actually, because it's this one day where there's equal bounds between the light and the dark, the masculine and the feminine. There's as much light as there is darkness. But the thing about the equinox, which is interesting, is that it's kind of like when you're watching a movie and the villain starts to win, because everything is great and fine and very equal, but you're also about to tip over into this darkness that is totally out of your control. So it's really the time when we cautiously look back and take stock and appreciate what we have, but also sort of start to gird yourself for the incoming darkness and all the things that means. It's basically like the witch's Thanksgiving.
The witch's Thanksgiving. I like that. Now, there's often, when you're talking about autumn holidays, autumn occurrences, there's talk about a thinness of the veil between worlds.
Right.
And how do you look at that? Is that something real? Is it something that we can feel?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? So essentially when you have this very liminal state, right, when the things start to change between the tipping point between light and darkness, and you have this basically this twilight period, essentially. So it's really about, the idea of transition is why the veil starts to thin. And the concept of the veil is really interesting to me because, I was reading this author, Adrian Bott, was discussing the idea of like this physical veil, this like thing that gets thinner. And does that come from ancient traditions, or does that come from like Victorian spiritualism, where people needed a more like physical idea to conduct the sort of pageantry that they were doing, to do these seances and stuff like that? Because you had the old concept of what the world was before it was really mapped out, and like how big that was. Like you didn't necessarily need a spiritual, like vertical higher realm. It was just sort of magic was all over. So I tend to think of the veil as a more conceptual idea where just in any kind of state of transition or liminal space, you have more ability to connect to something that's like quote unquote beyond, or usually inaccessible.
So when we talk about these veils, there's often the idea that something can sort of come through and it's easier to do so. And for, say, like old Halloween, it's supposed to be, the spirits of the departed? But are there other things besides, say, our old traditional, ghosts, old Aunt Sue or whoever coming through to say hello, that sort of find it easier to reach humans during this time?
Other non-human entities?
Perhaps.
I think that, it's really a lot of witchcraft today is about the idea of like focus and manifestation, and it really is that concept of like you end up where you look, right? You follow where you look and or direction that you're going in. And so in these times in which we're giving these ideas more focus and more emphasis, then of course you are more likely to be in connection with any kind of thing that you're wanting to conjure. Like once you're thinking about these spooky things, like who knows what could come through. That's the excitement. And that's why, the idea of the sort of utility of being scared or confronting those fears and like bringing all those things out at once is personally useful at the end of the day, hopefully.
All right, well, Hank, keep that thought. The Ravens are telling me I need to take a brief break, and we will be right back on Desert Oracle Radio. Autumn 2019. We are talking tonight with our guest, Laura Bolt, who is a writer and journalist with a special focus on the occult, on witchcraft, on the subcultures associated with these things, all the interesting stuff.
It's a pretty good beat.
It's a good beat. I agree. Tell me some of the interesting things you've done on this beat.
So when I first moved to LA a couple years ago, my degree is in comparative religion and mysticism, which is not useful at all until it was. And I moved here, I didn't really know anyone, and I ended up at a full moon party at the daughter of a celebrity's house. And I was like, I guess this is what LA is. And, in like 2 months or so, I was seeing all of these things where, people were going to bars, they were going to Stub on Sky buying crystals, and of course, they were doing both. But having this sort of subculture around this like healing modalities and witchcraft and New Age culture just became very obvious that it was a really powerful thing, and it's become something that, it was just had a life of its own in a significant way. So I started writing about that. That's why you and I know each other. And since then, it's really just become this, you look at witchcraft in LA, like in the 60s, and it was much darker, more culty, like more sinister almost thing, more like underground. Like great aesthetically, super cool, but you look today and there's just this aspect of like guru culture and commercialism, and it's become a very sort of clean, safe place for people to do really good, important work, but also to sort of sell themselves in a way that they weren't doing 10 years ago, or at least not on the scale. So it's been an interesting scene to watch grow.
So the kind of classic occult revival of the late 60s, 70s, while it certainly had its New Age components and its bright spots, there was definitely at least a media focus. I remember that Time magazine cover with the Baphomet, devil head in black, the occult revival. And then you had all the weird people who didn't really seem to be all that much into any of the books and the stuff that took reading and concentration, but kind of attached like barnacles to some of the ideas and concepts, and it got really kind of a nasty, almost medieval sort of feel to it, it seems. What's different about now?
I feel like there's a few strains that have led it to become what it is now, and one of them really is that aesthetic Instagram culture where the bright and shiny bits go really far, and you can take that sort of kernel and create a brand with it. And it gets really for some reason, the more information that's out there, and obviously we're in a time when you essentially have a compendium of human knowledge at all times at your fingertips. I don't know if there's a name for it, but for some reason it seems like the more information that you have access to, the less likely you are to actually investigate those things and to go into it. So you can really take a blurb and make it a lifestyle. And a lot of the stuff is very blurbable, and it's very shareable, and it's very consumable. And you just have this DIY ability, which works for a lot of people in times of significant political change and tumultuous social structure. People are really looking for something to grab onto, and a lot of this stuff is very easy to grab onto, and it's very personalized. And the thing about the company that we worked with was, astrology is the study of you and the science of people themselves and their human interactions. So it's very easy to market.
Yeah, there's not really a filter. Well, can you really say there's not a filter if it's Instagram? But there's not an editorial filter, I guess, to put it in a certain light that might meet the preconceptions of an editor, an assignment editor at the TV news or the newspaper or the cable station, whatever it is. And
I'm sort of interested in the idea that, what you had in the 60s were more group-focused things because the information just wasn't as readily available. So you did have to sort of find a person to follow, or you had to fall into a community. And with the internet, with social media, it's very easy to be very isolated in that. So, there are obviously ways to connect, but there's also ways of just sort of doing it in the privacy of your own home that people, I think, gravitate towards.
So, do you see people making their communities of practice, say, more social media type of things because it's easier to get to know people who do the things you're interested in?
Yeah, it lowers the barrier of entry, which is good in a lot of ways and problematic in other ways. So it's a double-edged sword, but it's easier to engage in this from behind a screen in some ways than to put yourself out there. And there's a strength in community and also a vulnerability in finding that community. So when you find this consumable content that happens to be occult related or witchcraft related, and people, the design of it is great and the slogans are strong, and so the branding of I've wanted to write something about the branding of it for a while, but yeah, it's a strong look now, and people are really utilizing it. So it'll be interesting to see where it ends up in the next 5 years or so. Like, does it have legs, or what happens at this point?
So the branding that you're talking about is organic. It's not, there's not that I'm aware of. Maybe there is. If there is, I hope they call in a witchcraft control unit that's deciding what things look like.
There's not a high council, if that's what if that's who that would be. Yeah, I think it's more just creative people are drawn to this. So you see it from lots of different perspectives. And there's a political element. There's a part of it that is very related to modern feminism and fourth wave feminism. And a lot of this is a very good and healthy and natural expression of people being able to take power into their own hands and being able to sort of reclaim a religious structure that felt alien to them, or felt oppressive, or felt traumatic in a lot of ways. So you do have a much more widespread way of doing things, but you also have a way that feels more personal to a lot of people. That, at the end of the day, if someone is coming to a system wanting to learn and wanting to grow and be better, that's a great thing.
So when I was young and I was interested in this stuff, and my world around me didn't seem to have any doors opening, I went around looking for a book, shaking down the libraries, going to the weird counterculture shop that sold Wicca books and bongs, that sort of deal.
As one does.
As one does when one is seeking bumper stickers for a van with shag carpet or anything of that nature.
They should really come with a carpet. They should just hand out the bumper stickers. You don't have to go looking for those. It feels unfair.
And I remember having a sense of, well, this is all kind of about you. I can walk out into the desert or a backyard or an alley or whatever and focus on something and say some sort of words and have some intent for it. And that by the book is legit, but what do you miss if you don't have, like you have in a church? We were talking about St. Paul earlier tonight, and he was writing these letters, sort of an early social media, to all these small groups who were forming these kind of house churches, and they had to lay low because it wasn't, allowed in the society. And so you did end up with sometimes just kind of like lone wolves with letters trying to figure out what to do, and other times you had communities. What do you gain with a community, and how formal, or does it need to be formal at all?
I mean, one of the things about mysticism in particular, which is why I really liked studying it, was that it was kind of like the rebels of religion and the people who were sort of engaging in these things that weren't accessible to other people, and they were doing something wrong and untoward and inappropriate, and they were getting beyond in a way that wasn't for anyone else. So, the lone wolf thing is something that I think there's a tradition for, and there's a precedent for in a lot of ways. And, that sort of communion with the divine and saying that I'm going to breach this barrier by myself because I've earned it, because I've wanted it more, I tried more. There's a power in that for sure. I was talking to someone earlier about all this stuff and then the value of engaging in these practices, and she was saying that there's, the ritual of saying something or saying a phrase that has been said, a trillion times in a church by a trillion other people, like engaging in this body of energy that has been doing these things for so long, like does tap you into the sort of power that feels very transformative. At the same time, like even when you're doing these things in your apartment by yourself, you're doing a Samhain ritual, you're doing an equinox ritual, these things, they go back to this mythology that's back from, Persephone going into the underworld. And so you're honoring something that is actually very ancient and that has been playing out in different ways over thousands and thousands of years. So, whether you're doing it in a community or you're doing it by yourself, these archetypes, these myths are still something that we're paying homage to and connecting with. And, you're doing doing it with people, you're creating a certain sense of power. You're doing it by yourself. You're also building up that power within you, and that feels very witchy at the end of the day.
What is it about, and well, it's wilderness and the outdoors in general, I guess, but what is it about the desert, especially the desert outside of Los Angeles, that seems to have this very strong pull for people who are interested in practicing these old religions, these old pagan beliefs that are reborn in our modern society?
You have a very functional answer, which is access, and, it's 3 hours from Los Angeles, which is great. Another way, you are stripped of these trappings where you could go to parks in LA, things around here, you can get to nature, of course, but you still have these reminders of where you are. So connecting to the past with those things stripped away feels a lot easier when you go out to the desert. And also, I don't know if this is true, but you can tell me, you also have those ley lines out there. So you're in this energetic vortex, and that's what the Integratron is built on, supposedly, in the giant rock out there. And so you have this sort of energetic pull that may be dragging people out there.
All right, let's talk about this for a minute. Now, there are some people out here who know about the ley lines and the idea of the vortex. In fact, our radio station here sells T-shirts.
Are you in the vortex? Are we broadcasting from the vortex?
Well, according to the T-shirt, yeah. We're right here in downtown Joshua Tree. But tell us what you know about these ley lines in particular and where they run.
My understanding of ley lines has always been it's essentially like an energetic latitude longitude. So you have this, like say you're looking at Google Maps and you go to the topographical view, right? So you can see how the structures of nature are forming. So this is sort of like a skeleton over that is energetic connections, like a disambiguated map, essentially. And when they cross, you have these powerful sort of vortex fields. And apparently outside of, or in Joshua Tree, or in Landers, I guess, there is one of these vortexes, and that's where the Integratron grabs its power from. That's why the well that has the water is supposed to be so good. And I think Stonehenge is on one as well. And yeah, it's just these sort of fields of power that, I guess we were talking about the veil earlier, that are these thin areas of significant power, significant transformation that things can get back and forth from, and just sort of creates these places, not Bermuda Triangle exactly, but places where weird things can happen and power can be harnessed.
So if you're just joining us, we're on the line with Laura Bolt, who is a writer and journalist who specializes in all the stuff we love here at Desert Oracle Radio. The occult, weird California history, witchery, etc. And she just brought up something interesting, which is the Integratron. If you haven't been out here, you got to go see the Integratron. It was built by a former aerospace engineer named George Van Tassel. And according to George, he was instructed by visitors from beyond who told him where to build this thing and how to do it, and maybe led him out to Giant Rock, which is a giant rock you can also visit, in the first place. And what's especially odd about the idea of these ley lines and energy lines and Integratron, you can say, it's a bunch of nonsense. There's no science behind that. Here's something interesting. The Landers quake, which had been the second most devastating quake in terms of its energy in the early 1990s, happened on a fault that seismologists had not been previously aware of, the Landers Fault. thanks, Laura, for joining us. Something I need to mention is that we are trying to get it together a little bit more at the Desert Oracle Institute because we make the radio shows and the field guides and the various events, but we have not been quite so clever with the income part of the proposition. So now we have a membership drive within the Desert Oracle Institute, if you will, an elite organization. The kind of people who, I don't know, the kind of people who might loan their witchcraft books to you. So why don't you go to our website, desertoracle.com, click the Become a Patron link right up there on the top. It's in our Twitter bio, too. Can you imagine having to go through life like that? Talking about the link in your Twitter bio. Well, we don't judge. We don't judge everybody else that much, but we do have to judge ourselves. So if you can contribute a few dollars a month, we'll be able to keep producing these broadcasts and podcasts and live shows. And yes, even the Printed Field Guide, hopefully a little more often. We're trying for one of those genius grants, but we can't figure out how to apply. So in the meantime, we appreciate your support. And you're going to get some interesting stuff for joining us in this weird endeavor. Radio scripts that nobody's ever seen, believe me. Some bonus episodes, the stuff people always inexplicably ask me about. Like, why isn't there an hour-long version of whatever conversation with Brenda Mays? That sort of thing. Well, maybe there is. Maybe it's not on the podcast for a reason, But I'll tell you this. A couple of dollars a month, and then it's like you work at Desert Oracle and you can't leave, and you're out in the desert in this highway cabin, coyotes howling and semi-trucks air braking and wild cries from the saloon parking lot, dazzling lights in the sky hovering over the stoplight. So I'll send you some honestly questionable radio scripts secretly every month. Anything we can do to make a deal is what I'm saying. You need me to do your voicemail greeting? You got a problem at home? Somebody or something that needs to be taken care of? There's a tier for that. Tiers, like in Dante, like a Bosch painting. DesertOracle.com. Click on Be a Patron. Subscribe to our field guide. And join us again next Friday night, 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. Get the podcast wherever you like to get podcasts. And good night from the voice of the desert.